Here I am back in Visual Studio with my Hello World application open. Now the first thing I want to do before I do anything else, and actually I should do this very frequently as I write code, is I want to save all of my changed files. So I've written a lot of code, and I want to point out here this colored bar. So I've got yellow color there, more yellow there, a little bit of green there, and a little bit of yellow there. And then when I select Save All, everything turns to green. So what the green means is that that's code that I've made a change to during this editing session while this instance of Visual Studio has been open. And yellow indicates unsaved changes. So if I were to now shut down Visual Studio, fire it back up, open this file again, there wouldn't be any color lines here at all because it's all been previously saved. As I start making changes, yellow will appear next to the lines that I've made changes to. And then I can save it, and it'll again turn green, indicating that I've made changes during this editing session. So that's what that part of Visual Studio looks like. That's a real handy feature to have. You can kind of see what you've changed, and if you need to go back and undo any changes. Okay, so the next thing I need to do is build the solution. And I'll do that by coming up here to Build and select, now if I can control my mouse, Build Solution. And that's what fires off the process of compiling all of the code. So if you watch the status bar down here, it says Build Started. The output window by default opens up, and you can see Build Started, the name of the project. And then it says Ready again. So that means that it completed compiling. If there were any errors, I would get a message that it compiled with errors. And also I can see the basic steps in building this solution. Now in this case, I only have a single project in the solution. It's a fairly simple project, and so I have a very simple output from that build. But if I have more projects, if they're complex, if they're compiling a number of different components, having to perform various build tasks that you can define, then there could be hundreds of lines here as part of building this solution. Okay, but if this did not build successfully, I would have gotten 0 succeeded, 1 failed, and then if there's nothing to compile, if I haven't changed anything since the last time I compiled, I would get 1 up to date, and nothing would have happened. And then various reasons to skip. I can mark things to not be compiled every time I build a solution, and you have a lot of flexibility in how you define the build. But again, this very simple solution, I have a single project. It has, well, really a couple code files, but really only one code file that I care about. And so it compiled fairly quickly. Oh, and if any errors did occur during the build, I would get an error output window as well. And then from there, I can look at all the errors. I can double click on them to go to the location of the error and so forth. There's a lot of support for figuring out what went wrong with a compile that are built into Visual Studio. Okay, so now I've compiled it successfully, and so I can run it. So what I want to do is come up here to the Debug menu, and I want to start debugging. Now you can also just press F5 by default, and typically that's what I'm going to do in a regular application. But I can, but I'll select it there from the menu, and that'll open up. Well, actually what it'll do is it'll check to see if anything needs to be built again. It doesn't, and so it opens up the console window. It prints out my Hello World text, and then presents that prompt to the user that says press any key to continue. Okay, so the application ran. It did exactly what I wanted to, so we have an application that we wrote, and it's executing correctly. So I'll go ahead and hit the Enter key, and that shuts down the console window and takes me back into Visual Studio. Now the only reason that I came back into Visual Studio is because I ran the application from Visual Studio. This is now an executable file that's out in the file system, and if I run that directly from within Windows without Visual Studio, then it's going to open up a window and just be a regular console application. No Visual Studio needs to be involved. And in that case, the debugger won't be attached to the process. Okay, so I've ran it, and so I'm going to look at this output window again. So what the output window does here, this is for the execution of the application. Remember, I saw a lot of stuff in the output window from compiling the application or building the solution. But it's a high-level list of what happened as the program executes. and it displays both successful actions as well as any problems that arise. And this is one of the many useful tools in Visual Studio for figuring out what might be going wrong. So if anything weird happened with my application, it didn't start or I didn't see anything, then I can come here and start to get some clues about what went wrong. And can scroll back up in here. You can see there's a lot of things happening. It loads various assemblies, various threads start, VS host. This is a lot of the background stuff. Basic thread starts, loaded different applications, and exited with a code of 0, which is the default for no errors. But if anything went wrong, there would be some kind of not necessarily clear messages, but it would start to give you a clue. And many times you could Google or Bing that the message that you see that indicates some sort of a problem and include Visual Studio 2015 or console application or something like that, just to make use your good search foo, and there you can start to figure out what it might have gone wrong. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about building projects, and specifically take a look at the Build menu, because this contains a few sections with commands that may not be immediately obvious what they might be used for. Okay, so the Solution section is this section up here. And this contains the build options for all the projects within the solution. Again, I only have a single project in this particular solution, but in a real-world application, I might have a half dozen or a dozen projects. And I can choose to build them all as an entire solution. And then the project section here applies just to the specific project that's currently selected. That I have, usually it's that I have a code editor window open for within that project. I only have one project here, so the only option is console application. And so as you can see, I have pretty much just the same options here for projects that I do for solutions, other than the ability to publish the console application one. And that's essentially a deployment step where you publish the application. Okay, and then there's the third section for Configuration Manager. This section lets you define special build configurations and how you want to go about building the configurations. For the simple console application, I don't need anything special. But for web applications, for other desktop type of applications that have multiple components, that maybe I need to go out and perform other actions that are outside of Visual Studio, then I can set up a configuration. Okay, so the two main sections here are Build section for solutions and the Build section for a particular project. As I pointed out, most of the options in the two sections are the same. So the Build option, in both cases, build the solution and build the project, is going to compile the artifacts that are necessary to get a build. So Visual Studio is pretty intelligent about what's been compiled before, and so if there's different components that have already been compiled and you haven't made any changes to the code, then it won't build those components. But then you can use the rebuild solution, or rebuild the project, is going to force a rebuild of every artifact, regardless of whether it's up to date or not. So build is typically faster than rebuild, because often it's not doing as much work. But that's going to be especially true for large solutions. So your pattern of compilation as you're building a solution might be to build first and then rebuild before checking into source control or deploying the application. And then of course your choice is going to depend on what makes sense for your situation. And then we have these clean options, clean solution and clean project. And what that does is it removes assemblies and other generated artifacts from the output folders. So generally, build and rebuild are going to replace output artifacts, but doing a clean can be useful to avoid problems and start from a clean slate, particularly if you remove components from a project. So if you don't clean the output folders, then those old artifacts from building those components that are no longer part of your project or solution might still be included within those output folders. So that's what clean does. Okay, and so as I mentioned, the last section here deals with configurations. A build configuration is where you set compiler and other options to control various aspects of what the build produces. By default, Visual Studio ships with two build configurations, debug and release. All right, and so you can view those two configurations by clicking on Configuration Manager, and there you have debug and release. And as you can see, you can also create new configurations, and you can edit existing configurations as well. And then you can also target different configurations of CPUs as well. All right, so I have this debug configuration. That's the default for most Visual Studio project templates, because you're going to want to include all of the symbols and everything, and various things, various compiler directives. You want those on for debug build of the project as you're developing it. So if you check the checkbox here within the build column, this means that the specified project is included in the build, because you could have multiple projects and you don't want to compile something that you've already built, deployed, it's tested, and so forth. Maybe you don't want to keep compiling it over and over again, particularly if it takes a long time to compile. A complex project could take an hour to compile and build. So if you have multiple projects and one or more of them are tested, you don't need to worry about them anymore, building them again. Just uncheck this box here. Okay, and one example of a project that you may not want to build every time is a setup project. Those generally take a while to build because they include multiple projects and require plenty of processing. Also, you generally don't need to create a new setup project every time you build. So you can open the configuration and uncheck the build for any project that you don't want to include. And your setup project might be included here because you've included it within the solution. And then you can also force a build on that project that you've excluded here by right-clicking on the project in Solution Explorer and selecting a build option from there. Okay, and so that's basically the same way that the build menu options work. Okay, so Configuration Manager is a bit sparse in its available options. The reason for that is that you can now customize each project in a solution based on a specific configuration. Okay, so to do that, I'm going to close out of here, and I'm going to come up here to Solution Explorer, right-click on the project, and open up the Properties pages for that project. And then I can come here to the Build page, and notice that I have drop-down list boxes for the different build configurations. So I'm currently set to the debug build, and so that's the one that is marked as active right now. But I could select the release option as well, and there's just the debug. This just indicates, this is the same as that, but this just indicates that the debug option or configuration manager is the current active one, which I can see up there anyway. Okay, and right there, I can make any changes, and this will configure the configuration manager in the build for this project for the debug configuration manager. And I can select release and make changes to that configuration manager as well. All right, and a couple of things that you probably want to have different between the debug and release version is whether or not you define these debug constants and define a trace constant. Because what you can do is you can test to see if those constants are set in the code and actually execute code differently based on whether this is a debug or release build. Maybe you want to comment out a section, or not comment it out, but not execute a section of code that's in a debug build because maybe it connects to a production server, and you definitely don't want to do that while you're testing your application because maybe you delete all the records in a database or whatever. And so you can write conditional code around it in order to not execute that code. So that's just one of many kinds of options. And then there's various other options that you can set in order to configure this build. Okay, and so just to make the point, if I then come down here and select the release build, notice that the debug constant is no longer selected, but the trace constant is, because maybe you want to use some of the trace functionality within your release version of the application to get runtime information. And notice that the release version also has optimized code set. A lot of times you don't want to optimize your code, or at least have the compiler optimize the code during development, because that can obscure the reasons for certain types of bugs. So you want to leave it unoptimized. When you're ready to release it, check this option or use the release build, test the application one more time that everything is still working okay, and then you can deploy it out into the wild.